"You're not coming with us, Helen. We need someone responsible to stay behind and clean up after Thanksgiving," my daughter-in-law said with a smile as she slid a card across the table. I looked down at the cream-colored card resting beside my plate. The words were printed in elegant gold lettering, the kind usually reserved for wedding invitations or holiday greetings. Family trip, 10 days in Aspen. Departure, tomorrow morning. Beneath the itinerary was a handwritten note. "While we're gone, please clean the house, organize the storage room, and keep an eye on the dog." For a moment, I thought it had to be a joke. Thanksgiving had always been my favorite holiday. For nearly 40 years, I had been the one waking up before sunrise to prepare the turkey, bake the pies, and set the table with the good china. Even after my husband, Robert, passed away 3 years earlier, I kept the tradition alive. I told myself family mattered more than grief. Family mattered more than loneliness. That evening, the dining room glowed with warm light. The scent of roasted turkey and cinnamon filled the air. Outside, the November wind rattled the bare branches against the windows. Inside, my son Brandon sat at the far end of the table scrolling through his phone. My granddaughter Megan picked at her mashed potatoes. Vanessa sipped wine and watched me read the card. Nobody laughed. Nobody said there had been a mistake. Nobody looked surprised. I slowly lifted my eyes from the card. "A family trip?" I asked quietly. Vanessa smiled. "We booked it months ago." Months ago. The words settled heavily in my chest. Months ago meant they had planned this long before Thanksgiving. Long before I spent 2 days shopping for groceries, polishing silverware, and preparing a meal for everyone sitting around that table. "I didn't know anything about it," I said. Brandon finally looked up from his phone. "We didn't want to bother you with the details." His voice sounded casual, detached, as if he were discussing the weather instead of explaining why his own mother had been excluded from a family vacation. I nodded slowly. Then I folded the card and placed it neatly beside my napkin. The conversation around the table resumed almost immediately. Vanessa began talking about ski lessons. Megan mentioned a heated outdoor pool. Brandon discussed restaurant reservations. They spoke about the trip as if I had already disappeared from the room, as if my role had been assigned and accepted. Caretaker, housekeeper, dog sitter. I pushed a piece of turkey around my plate and listened. Every now and then, someone laughed. Every now and then, I caught myself glancing toward Robert's empty chair. He would have noticed. He always noticed. The meal ended an hour later. Plates were stacked in the sink. Leftovers were packed into containers. One by one, everyone drifted toward the living room. I remained alone at the dining table. The folded card sat in front of me. I picked it up again and read every word a second time. Then a third. Family trip. Not family except Helen. Not family minus mom. Just family. Somehow, I wasn't included in that definition anymore. The realization hurt far more than the card itself. I sat there long after the dishes had gone cold and the house had grown quiet. Finally, I stood and carried my plate into the kitchen. As I passed the hallway, I noticed something sticking out of Megan's backpack. It was a brochure from the Aspen resort. Curious, I pulled it free just enough to see the cover. Across the top, someone had written in black marker, "Carter Family Thanksgiving Vacation." Every name was listed underneath. Brandon, Vanessa, Megan, even the dog. My name wasn't there. I stood in the hallway for a long moment, staring at the brochure in my hands. The house around me was quiet except for the faint sound of laughter drifting from the living room. Brandon was telling some story. Vanessa laughed first. Megan followed. It sounded like any other family gathering, any other Thanksgiving. Yet something felt different now. It was as if a curtain had been pulled back, revealing a truth that had been standing in front of me for years. I carefully slid the brochure back into Megan's backpack and walked upstairs. My bedroom sat at the end of the hall, exactly as it had since Robert and I bought the house 38 years earlier. The framed photographs on the dresser showed birthdays, graduations, Christmas mornings, and family vacations. I sat on the edge of the bed and studied those smiling faces. For the first time, I noticed something unsettling. In the newer photographs, I was always standing slightly apart, sometimes on the edge of the frame, sometimes holding a purse, a jacket, or someone else's belongings. Always present, but somehow separate. I opened the nightstand drawer and pulled out an old photo album. The pages crackled softly as I turned them. There was Brandon at 10 years old holding a fishing pole beside Robert. There was our first family road trip to Yellowstone. There was Thanksgiving 20 years ago, Everyone crowded around a table far too small for the number of guests. Back then, family felt simple. Or perhaps I had only believed it was. Downstairs, another burst of laughter echoed through the house. I closed the album. My chest felt heavy, but not because of anger. Not yet. What bothered me most was how normal everyone seemed. No guilt. No awkwardness. No apology. Vanessa had handed me a list of chores disguised as a holiday card, and nobody around that table had questioned it. Not even my son. Especially not my son. The next morning, I woke before sunrise out of habit. The house was still dark. I padded downstairs and started a pot of coffee. Through the kitchen window, I watched the pale November sky slowly brighten. The backyard looked peaceful beneath a thin layer of frost. For a few minutes, I simply stood there holding my coffee mug and listening to the silence. Then I noticed something on the refrigerator. A printed checklist secured with a magnet. At first, I assumed it was a grocery list. But as I stepped closer, I realized it was another set of instructions. Feed Charlie twice daily. Water plants every other day. Organize garage shelves. Clean guest bedroom closets. The handwriting was Vanessa's. My eyes moved down the page until they stopped at a final note. Thank you, Helen. We knew we could count on you. I stared at those words for several seconds. We knew we could count on you. Not because they valued me. Not because they appreciated me. Because they expected me. Expected my time. Expected my labor. Expected my loyalty. The realization settled over me like cold rain. Later that afternoon, while everyone packed suitcases upstairs, I remained in the kitchen baking pumpkin bread. The familiar routine steadied my thoughts. As the scent filled the room, Megan wandered in. She opened the refrigerator, grabbed a bottle of water, and smiled at me. Grandma, you should see the resort. It is incredible. I smiled back. I am sure it is. She hesitated. Mom has been planning it forever. Forever. The word landed heavily. How long? I asked. Megan shrugged. Since spring, I think. She started booking everything before school ended. After school ended. Nearly 6 months earlier. Long before Thanksgiving. Long before anyone had given me that card. Megan took a sip of water and wandered back upstairs, unaware that she had just confirmed the one thing I had been trying not to believe. This was never a last-minute decision. It was never an oversight. It was a plan. And somehow, I was the only person who had not known about it. The morning they left was unusually bright for late November. Sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows, while suitcases rolled across hardwood floors upstairs. I stood at the sink rinsing a coffee mug and listened to the familiar sounds of a family preparing for a trip. Zippers closed. Doors opened and shut. Footsteps moved quickly from room to room. Every sound reminded me that everyone in this house had been part of a plan that excluded me. Vanessa came downstairs first, dressed in a cream-colored sweater and expensive boots. She glanced around the kitchen before checking her watch. We should be on the road in 15 minutes, she called toward the staircase. Brandon followed a few moments later carrying 2 travel bags. He stopped long enough to grab a bottle of water from the refrigerator. Everything should be pretty straightforward while we are gone, he said. Straightforward. I almost smiled at the word. As if caring for their home, their dog, their plants, and their endless list of responsibilities was some small favor they were asking. I am sure I can manage, I replied calmly. He nodded without really looking at me. Then he headed back upstairs. That hurt more than I expected. Not because of the trip. Not because of Vanessa. Because my son seemed completely unaware of what he was doing. Or perhaps he was aware and simply no longer cared. A few minutes later, Megan came into the kitchen carrying her backpack. Unlike the others, she looked slightly uncomfortable. Grandma, I wish you were coming, she said softly. I looked at her for a moment. There was honesty in her eyes. No manipulation. No calculation. Just the awkward sincerity of a teenager caught between adults. Thank you, sweetheart, I said. That means a lot. She smiled and hugged me quickly before heading outside. Through the front window, I watched her climb into the SUV. The driveway soon filled with activity. Doors slammed. Luggage disappeared into the back. Vanessa walked around the vehicle, checking something on her phone. Brandon adjusted the navigation system. Then, just before getting into the passenger seat, Vanessa turned toward the house. She waved. Not warmly. Not affectionately. More like someone acknowledging an employee before leaving the office. 10 minutes later, the vehicle disappeared around the corner. Silence settled over the house. Complete silence. I stood alone in the foyer staring at the empty driveway. For years I had dreamed about having a quiet house again. A little peace. A little space. Yet standing there, I felt something unexpected. Relief. No criticism. No instructions. No schedules. No pretending. Just silence. I locked the front door and slowly walked through the house. The living room looked exactly as it had the night before. Throw blankets draped over the couch. A half-finished magazine on the coffee table. Shoes abandoned near the entryway. I moved from room to room noticing things I had overlooked for years. In the guest room, several storage boxes were stacked against the wall. In Brandon's home office, folders and paperwork covered the desk. Upstairs, I paused outside the primary bedroom. The door stood slightly open. Normally I would have turned away immediately. Privacy mattered. But something made me hesitate. From where I stood, I could see a file folder, sitting on a chair beside the dresser. Bright blue, thick with documents. Across the tab, written in black marker, were 3 words that immediately caught my attention. House transfer options. I stared at the folder. Then I looked down the empty hallway. The house remained perfectly still. For the first time all week, a feeling stronger than sadness began to take shape. Curiosity. I remained in the hallway for several seconds, staring at the blue folder. The house was silent except for the distant hum of the refrigerator downstairs. Part of me wanted to walk away. For most of my life, I had respected boundaries, even when others ignored mine. But another part of me remembered the card on the table, the checklist on the refrigerator, the brochure with every family member listed except me. Slowly, I stepped into the room. The folder sat exactly where I had first seen it. I picked it up and carried it to the reading chair near the window. Sunlight spilled across the pages as I opened it. At first, the documents looked ordinary. Property records, mortgage information, financial statements. Then I noticed several pages clipped together near the back. Across the top was the name of a real estate consulting company. Beneath it was a proposal outlining different options for transferring ownership interests in a residential property. My stomach tightened. I continued reading. Several sections were highlighted in yellow. There were notes written in Vanessa's handwriting along the margins. Some of the comments discussed renovations. Others discussed future property value. One sentence caught my attention immediately. If primary owner agrees, transfer process becomes significantly easier. Primary owner. I read the phrase twice. Then a third time. Not Brandon. Not Vanessa. Primary owner. I closed the folder for a moment and looked around the room. Family photographs lined the shelves. Vacation souvenirs sat neatly arranged on a cabinet. Everything looked normal. Yet nothing felt normal anymore. I reopened the folder and continued reading more carefully. The proposal appeared incomplete. There were no signatures. No finalized agreements. But the intent was obvious. Someone had been exploring ways to gain greater control over the property. Someone had invested time researching options. Someone had already taken several steps forward. I returned the folder exactly where I had found it and left the room. The rest of the afternoon passed quietly. I folded laundry, watered the plants, fed Charlie, the golden retriever sleeping peacefully near the back door. Outwardly, nothing had changed. Inwardly, everything had. That evening, after dinner, I found myself standing in front of the hallway closet. Inside sat several storage boxes that had not been opened in years. Most belonged to Robert. When he passed away, I could not bring myself to sort through everything. Some memories were easier to leave untouched. Tonight felt different. I pulled down one box and carried it to the dining room table. Dust coated the lid. Inside were old insurance papers, tax records, family photographs, and legal documents. For nearly an hour I sorted through folders. Then I found a large envelope with my name written across the front in Robert's familiar handwriting. My hands froze. I had not seen that handwriting in years. Carefully, I opened the envelope. Inside was a copy of the property deed. I adjusted my reading glasses and looked closer. My heartbeat quickened. The deed listed only one owner. Helen Carter. Not Robert and Helen Carter. Not Brandon Carter. Just me. I read the document again to make certain I understood correctly. The house had been transferred entirely into my name years earlier. I sat back slowly in my chair. Outside, darkness settled across the neighborhood. Inside, the dining room felt strangely still. For days I had been asking myself why Vanessa seemed so confident. Why Brandon behaved as though decisions about the house were already theirs to make. Now a different question entered my mind. If the property belonged solely to me, How much did they actually know? And more importantly, what else had Robert prepared before he was gone? The next morning, I woke earlier than usual. The house remained quiet, and for the first time in years, there was nobody waiting for me to solve a problem, prepare a meal, or clean up after them. I carried a cup of coffee into the dining room and spread Robert's documents across the table. Sunlight filtered through the windows, illuminating every page. I spent hours reading. Some papers were ordinary, others were not. Slowly, a clearer picture began to emerge. Robert had been meticulous. Every account, every insurance policy, every legal document had been organized with extraordinary care. He had anticipated questions before they could be asked. He had prepared answers before problems could appear. Around noon, my phone rang. The screen displayed a familiar name. Arthur Reynolds. Arthur had been Robert's closest friend for nearly 40 years. They had played golf together, attended business meetings together, and spent countless afternoons arguing about baseball teams neither of them actually supported. After Robert passed away, Arthur checked on me from time to time. Not often, just enough to remind me I was not entirely alone. I answered the call. "Helen," he said warmly. "I was thinking about you. How are you doing?" I hesitated. Then I told him the truth. Not everything, just enough. The holiday trip, the card, the strange paperwork, the growing feeling that something was not right. Arthur remained silent for several seconds after I finished speaking. "I think we should have lunch," he finally said. 2 hours later, we were sitting in a small restaurant a few miles from my neighborhood. Arthur listened carefully while I explained everything in greater detail. When I mentioned the folder labeled House Transfer Options, his expression changed. Not surprise, recognition. That unsettled me immediately. "Arthur," I said quietly, "what do you know?" He folded his hands on the table and looked out the window for a moment before answering. "Robert came to see me about 8 months before he passed away." My heart skipped. "What did he say?" Arthur exhaled slowly. He was worried. I stared at him. "Worried about what?" "About you." The restaurant seemed to fade into the background. The clinking dishes. The conversations from nearby tables. Everything disappeared. Robert noticed things, Arthur continued. Little things. Changes in behavior. Conversations that stopped. When he entered a room. Assumptions people were making about the future. I felt a chill run through me. Arthur leaned forward slightly. He never accused anyone of anything. But he believed there might come a day when people would see you as an obstacle instead of family. I looked down at my hands. For a moment, I could not speak. "That sounds exactly like him," I whispered. Arthur nodded. He wanted to make sure you would always be protected. Then he reached into his briefcase and removed a sealed envelope. My name was written across the front in Robert's handwriting. The sight of it instantly tightened my throat. "He asked me to hold on to this," Arthur said. "He said I would know when the time was right." Carefully, I took the envelope. My fingers trembled slightly. Robert had written those words years ago, never knowing exactly when I would see them. Yet somehow he had known there would come a day when I needed them. Arthur placed a hand gently on the table. "Before you open it," he said, "there is something else you should know. The house is only part of what Robert arranged." I looked up. "What do you mean?" Arthur held my gaze. "Helen, your husband spent months preparing for a situation he hoped would never happen. And if I am right about what you have discovered so far, then there are people in your family who have absolutely no idea what he left behind." I did not open the envelope until I returned home. The drive back felt strangely quiet. Arthur's words replayed in my mind with every mile. "Robert was worried about you." The sentence lingered long after the restaurant disappeared behind me. When I finally pulled into the driveway, the house looked exactly as it had that morning. Calm, ordinary, almost innocent. Yet I no longer saw it the same way. I carried the envelope into the dining room and placed it carefully on the table. For several minutes, I simply stared at it. The handwriting alone was enough to bring back memories. Robert writing grocery lists. Robert signing birthday cards. Robert leaving little notes beside the coffee maker whenever he traveled for work. I ran my fingers gently across the paper before finally opening it. Inside was a letter. The date at the top showed it had been written less than 6 months before he passed away. "My dear Helen, if you are reading this, it means I was right about one thing. You will eventually need answers that I can no longer give you myself." I stopped reading for a moment. My eyes burned unexpectedly. Then I continued. The letter was not dramatic. It sounded exactly like Robert. Calm, practical, thoughtful. He explained that after his health began declining, he He spent a great deal of time reviewing finances, legal documents, and long-term plans. He wanted to ensure I would never have to depend on anyone else's generosity. Then I reached the part that changed everything. Several years earlier, Robert had established a family trust. I had vaguely remembered signing paperwork during a meeting with an attorney, but I had never paid close attention to the details. Robert always handled legal matters. According to the letter, the trust contained far more than our home. Investment accounts, savings accounts, rental property income, insurance proceeds. Everything had been placed under carefully structured protections. Most importantly, no transfers, distributions, or ownership changes could occur without my direct authorization. I read the paragraph twice, then a third time. Suddenly, the blue folder in Vanessa's room made much more sense. Someone had been exploring possibilities, exploring options, planning future outcomes. But planning and controlling were not the same thing. I continued reading. Near the end of the letter, Robert mentioned another document stored with our attorney, a private memorandum explaining his intentions in greater detail. He instructed me to request it only if circumstances made me question the motives of those closest to me. I leaned back slowly in my chair. Outside, the sun was beginning to set. Golden light stretched across the backyard. Charlie slept peacefully near the sliding door. Everything appeared unchanged, yet I felt as though I had stepped into an entirely different reality. For days, I had focused on the insult, the card, the exclusion, the assumptions. Now I understood something deeper. Those events were symptoms, not causes. The real story had been developing quietly for years. Later that evening, I called the attorney whose name appeared in Robert's letter. His assistant answered and scheduled an appointment for the following morning. After hanging up, I walked through the house one more time. This time, I noticed details I had previously ignored. The expensive renovation catalog stacked on the kitchen counter. Notes about remodeling projects. Discussions about future upgrades. Everywhere I looked, I saw evidence of plans for a future that seemed to assume my role had already been reduced to a formality. I stood in the foyer and looked around the empty house. Then I remembered the confidence in Vanessa's smile when she handed me that card. At the time, I thought she believed she had all the power. Now I was no longer so certain. And tomorrow, I intended to learn exactly how much Robert had anticipated before he was gone. The attorney's office occupied the third floor of a brick building downtown. I arrived 10 minutes early carrying Robert's letter in my purse. The receptionist greeted me warmly and led me to a conference room overlooking the city. A few minutes later, Mr. Henderson entered carrying a thick file. He had handled our legal affairs for years, and the moment he sat down, I could tell he already understood why I was there. "Helen," he said gently, "I was wondering when you might request this meeting." He opened the file and slid several documents across the table. "Your husband left very detailed instructions." For the next hour, he walked me through every part of the trust. Robert had not simply protected assets. He had protected decision-making authority. Every major account required my approval. Every property decision required my approval. Even future distributions to beneficiaries were tied to specific conditions and timelines. The more I learned, the more one fact became impossible to ignore. Nobody could legally take control of anything unless I willingly allowed it. Then Mr. Henderson opened a sealed memorandum and handed it to me. "This is the document Robert mentioned in his letter." My hands tightened around the pages. The memorandum was not written like a legal document. It was personal. Robert described his hopes for our family. He wrote about Brandon, about Megan, even about Vanessa. He wanted everyone to thrive. But near the end, his tone changed. He explained that if anyone attempted to pressure, manipulate, or isolate me in order to gain financial advantage, the trust granted me broad authority to suspend certain benefits indefinitely. I stared at the page. "He anticipated this?" I asked quietly. Mr. Henderson nodded. "Your husband was a careful observer." After leaving the office, I spent the afternoon reviewing copies of every document. Back at home, I sat at the dining room table while Charlie slept nearby. Piece by piece, I assembled a timeline. The folder in Vanessa's room, the renovation catalogs, the transfer proposals, the assumptions embedded in everyday conversations. None of it proved malicious intent. But together, the pattern was impossible to ignore. Around sunset, my phone buzzed with a message from Brandon. A photograph appeared on the screen. He and Vanessa stood in front of a mountain lodge, smiling beside a stone fireplace. Looks amazing here, Mom. Hope everything is going smoothly. I studied the image for a long moment. Not once did he ask how I was doing. Not once did he mention the hurtful way they had left. The message felt less like concern and more like a routine status check. I typed a simple reply. Everything is fine. Enjoy your trip. Then I set the phone aside. For the first time in days, I felt calm. Not because the situation hurt any less. It did. But uncertainty had been replaced by clarity. I no longer needed to guess. I no longer needed to wonder. The facts were sitting in front of me. Robert had spent months preparing protections that nobody seemed to know existed. Vanessa believed she understood the future. Brandon seemed content to follow her lead. Neither of them realized the foundation beneath their plans was very different from what they imagined. As darkness settled outside, I gathered the documents into neat folders and locked them in my desk. Then I walked through the house, turning off lights one room at a time. The silence no longer felt lonely. It felt useful. Because for the first time since receiving that card, I was no longer reacting to someone else's decisions. I was preparing for my own. 10 days passed more quickly than I expected. I never touched the garage shelves. I never reorganized the storage room. I never followed the checklist taped to the refrigerator. The plants were watered. Charlie was fed and cared for. The house remained clean because I lived there. But I refused to spend a single hour performing tasks that had been assigned to me like obligations. Instead, I met with advisors, reviewed documents, read every page Robert had left behind. By the time the trip was ending, I understood more about my own financial position than I had at any point during our marriage. On the afternoon of their return, I was sitting on the back patio with a cup of tea when I heard the SUV pull into the driveway. Doors slammed. Laughter filled the air. Suitcases rolled across the concrete. Through the window, I watched Vanessa step out first, wearing designer sunglasses and carrying several shopping bags. Brandon followed behind her. Megan climbed out last, looking tired from the trip. The front door opened. Voices echoed through the foyer. Then came silence. A few moments later, Vanessa appeared in the kitchen. Her expression changed immediately. She looked around, then toward the hallway, then toward the living room. "Helen," she called. I remained seated outside. A minute later, the sliding door opened. "There you are," she said. "We just got back." "I noticed," I replied pleasantly. Vanessa glanced toward the house again. "Did you not get around to the storage room?" I took a sip of tea. "No." She blinked. "What about the garage?" "No." Her smile tightened slightly. "The guest room closets?" "No." For several seconds, she simply stared at me. It was not outrage exactly. It was confusion. The confusion of someone whose expectations had collided with reality. Brandon stepped onto the patio. "Everything okay?" he asked. Vanessa folded her arms. Nothing on the list was done. Brandon looked surprised. Then he looked at me. "Mom." His tone suggested there must be some explanation. I nodded. "That is correct." Silence settled between us. For years, I would have rushed to smooth over the discomfort. I would have apologized, offered excuses, tried to restore harmony. This time, I did none of those things. Brandon shifted awkwardly. I thought maybe. He stopped speaking. Perhaps for the first time, he realized how strange the entire situation sounded. Vanessa recovered first. "We left instructions because we thought you would want to help." I met her gaze calmly. "You did not ask for help. You assigned responsibilities." Her expression hardened. "I think that is unfair." "Perhaps," I said, "but not nearly as unfair as planning a family vacation for 6 months and pretending I was not part of the family." Neither of them spoke. The words hung in the air. Simple, direct, impossible to misunderstand. Brandon looked away first. Vanessa looked angry. Megan, who had quietly joined us, looked embarrassed. I stood and set my empty cup on the patio table. "There is something I would like all of you to read after dinner," I said. Then I walked back into the house. Later that evening, while they unpacked suitcases and settled back into familiar routines, I sat alone in the dining room. In front of me rested a neat stack of folders. Property records, trust documents, letters, memorandums, evidence. Beside them sat a small cream-colored card. I had chosen it carefully. The card looked remarkably similar to the one Vanessa had placed beside my plate 10 days earlier. Only the message was different. Family meeting. Read carefully. Tomorrow morning. 7 o'clock. Mandatory. I placed the card in the center of the table and looked at it for a long moment. Then I smiled. Because for the first time since Thanksgiving, I knew exactly how the next conversation was going to begin. At exactly 7 o'clock the next morning, everyone gathered around the dining room table. The cream-colored card sat in the center beside the stack of folders. Brandon looked tired. Vanessa looked irritated. Megan looked nervous. I waited until everyone was seated before speaking. "Thank you for coming." Vanessa crossed her arms. "What is this about?" Instead of answering immediately, I slid a copy of the property deed across the table. Brandon picked it up first. His eyes moved across the page. Then he frowned. He read it again. "Mom," he said quietly, "this house is in your name." "Yes," I replied. Vanessa leaned forward and grabbed another copy. The confidence I had seen in her for years began to fade. "That cannot be right." "It is." Silence settled over the room. I opened the first folder and removed several additional documents. Trust agreements, legal memorandums, financial summaries. One by one, I placed them on the table. Nobody interrupted. Nobody joked. Nobody checked a phone. For the first time in a very long while, I had their complete attention. "After your father became ill," I said to Brandon, "he spent months preparing for the future." Brandon stared at the papers. Why did he never tell me? Because he hoped none of this would ever be necessary. I handed him Robert's letter. As he began reading, I watched his expression change. Confusion became surprise. Surprise became discomfort. Across from him, Vanessa remained unusually quiet. I continued speaking. "Your father wanted this family to stay together. He wanted everyone treated fairly. But he also wanted to make certain I would never become dependent on anyone else's approval." Vanessa finally spoke. "Nobody was trying to take anything from you." I met her gaze calmly. "Perhaps not. But someone was certainly making plans." Then I placed the transfer proposal from the blue folder onto the table. The room became very still. Vanessa looked down. Her face lost color. Brandon turned toward her. "What is this?" She opened her mouth, then closed it again. For several seconds, she could not answer. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse. I simply allowed the documents to speak for themselves. That was enough. Brandon looked from the proposal to the trust documents and back again. The realization was finally reaching him. Not all at once. Slowly. Painfully. Megan lowered her eyes. "Grandma," she said softly, "I am sorry." I smiled gently. "Thank you, sweetheart." Then I looked around the table. This meeting is not about punishment. Everyone listened. It is about understanding something that should have been obvious from the beginning. I paused. I am not a guest in this family. I am not an employee. I am not a caretaker assigned responsibilities whenever they become inconvenient. Nobody disagreed. I am your mother. I am your grandmother. And I deserve the same respect I have spent decades giving all of you. The silence that followed felt different from all the others. It was not uncomfortable. It was honest. Finally, Brandon folded his father's letter and looked at me. His eyes were wet. I should have paid attention sooner. I nodded. "Yes, you should have." For the first time, there were no excuses. No explanations. No attempts to minimize what had happened. Just truth. Later that morning, the documents were returned to their folders. The meeting ended quietly. No dramatic confrontation. No shouting. None was necessary. The facts had already done the work. As everyone left the dining room, I remained seated for a moment beside the window. Sunlight filled the room. Charlie slept peacefully near the doorway. The house felt different. Not because ownership had changed. It had always been mine. Not because the documents existed. They always had. The difference was that I finally understood my own value. And so did everyone else. Robert had protected far more than property. He had protected my dignity until I was ready to protect it myself.